Vasco da Gama, a name synonymous with exploration, daring, and the dawn of a new era, forever altered the course of global history by forging a sea route to India. This is the story of the man before the legend, the events that shaped him, and the brutal realities behind his voyages. It is a tale of ambition, religious fervor, and the ruthless pursuit of wealth that redrew the world map and established Portugal as a dominant maritime power. Born in the mid-15th century in Sines, a small coastal town in Portugal, Vasco da Gama's early life was steeped in the maritime traditions of his nation. Portugal, at the time, was a kingdom consumed by a thirst for exploration, each voyage a gamble for riches, glory, and expanded influence. Sines, with its views of the vast Atlantic, was a constant reminder of the possibilities that lay beyond the horizon. His father, Estevão da Gama, a minor nobleman, served as the commander of the Sines fortress, a position that granted him administrative and military authority over the region. He was responsible for defending the coastline against Berber pirates and organizing local defenses. While not wealthy, the da Gama family was respected, with ancestral ties and the favor of the Portuguese crown. His mother, Isabel Sodré, came from a family with strong naval connections, providing young Vasco with tales of daring voyages in distant lands. Details about Vasco's childhood are scarce, but as the son of a nobleman, he would have received an education befitting his status. This likely included reading, writing, Latin, arithmetic, and the fundamentals of astronomy and navigation. He may have begun his studies at a local parish school or a nearby religious center before potentially continuing his education in Coimbra, home to one of Europe's oldest universities. The academic atmosphere of Coimbra would have exposed him to mechanics, celestial navigation, geography, and shipbuilding. Portugal was actively developing cartography and navigation schools, most notably in Sagres, under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator's successors. However, the prevailing atmosphere of the era had a far greater impact on the young Vasco. Portugal was transforming into a nation where the sea was a matter of state policy. Under King John II, the search for a sea route to India intensified, with each southward step along the African coast celebrated as a triumph. Ships laden with gold, spices, and stories of new lands constantly arrived in Portuguese ports. Maps depicting territories beyond the Cape of Good Hope emerged, along with rumors of India's wealthy markets accessible by sea. Vasco grew up in a world where venturing into the unknown was no longer a dream but a royal endeavor. The da Gama family had close ties to the Order of Santiago, a religious military brotherhood that combined military service with Christian devotion. King John II served as the order's Grand Master, granting it significant political influence. This connection provided the da Gama family with support and patronage. Vasco, like his father, likely wore the order's cross, instilling in him a sense of duty, discipline, and the idea of serving the state rather than personal gain. Vasco da Gama's first notable act as an independent figure came in 1492, when King John II entrusted him with confiscating property from Castilian merchants whose ships were docked in Portuguese ports. This was in retaliation for the seizure of Portuguese ships in northern Spain. Vasco carried out the task swiftly and efficiently, demonstrating his decisiveness and organizational skills. While a minor event in European history, it showed Vasco's ability to follow royal orders and achieve results. By 1495, Portugal had a new monarch, King Manuel I, who was determined to continue the work of his predecessors. The plans to reach India by sea became more concrete, and the Royal Council debated who should lead this dangerous mission, to circumnavigate Africa, cross the Indian Ocean, and reach the heart of Eastern trade. Vasco da Gama's name was among the top candidates. He was not yet famous, nor had he performed great services for the crown, but he possessed the necessary qualities: noble lineage, naval experience, loyalty to the monarch, resolve, and leadership skills. Furthermore, he was not tied to major merchant interests, meaning he could act primarily as the king's representative rather than a trade guild's agent. Thus concluded the first chapter of Vasco da Gama's life, a time of learning, service, and the development of his character. He had yet to leave Europe, cross the Indian Ocean, or negotiate with Indian rulers, but his mind, character, and experience had prepared him to accept a challenge that would determine the fate of a maritime empire. As the 15th century drew to a close, Portugal stood on the cusp of a great achievement. For decades, its ships had been steadily advancing along the African coast. Prince Henry the Navigator had established navigation schools and launched the first serious expeditions. During the reigns of Kings Afonso V and John II, Portuguese explorers reached the Senegal and Congo rivers, and finally, the southern tip of the continent. Bartolomeu Dias's battling storms rounded the cape that would later be named the Cape of Good Hope, a symbol of hope for a sea route to India, bypassing Islamic intermediaries on land. After John II's death in 1495, King Manuel I, known as the Fortunate, ascended the Portuguese throne. The new monarch inherited not only the throne but also the ambition to find a direct sea route to India, avoiding the Mediterranean and Arab caravans. He gathered the best minds in the country, cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders, and even Jewish scholars expelled from Castile, whose knowledge proved vital for navigation and accurate calculations. One of them, Abraham Zacuto, compiled an astronomical almanac that allowed sailors to determine latitude using the sun's position. The Royal Council knew that Dias's discovery was only the beginning. They needed to not only round Africa but also reach the shores of India, establish contact with local rulers, establish trade, and return with proof of success. The question of who would lead this first truly long-distance maritime expedition was debated at length. Vasco's father, who already had military and administrative experience, was initially considered. However, due to his advanced age or death, he was unable to accept the appointment. The choice then fell to his son. Vasco da Gama was relatively unknown outside his province but possessed the necessary qualities. In the spring of 1497, King Manuel officially appointed Vasco da Gama as captain major of the expedition to India. Preparations began immediately, with the port of Restelo, west of Lisbon, serving as the main base. It was from there that the expedition would set sail. Shipyards worked tirelessly, building and equipping ships, stockpiling provisions, manufacturing tools, and reinforcing hulls. 4 ships were prepared in total. The São Gabriel, captained by Vasco himself, was the flagship. His brother, Paulo da Gama, commanded the nearly identical São Rafael. The Berrio, a smaller caravel, was highly maneuverable and intended for reconnaissance and communication. The 4th vessel was an unnamed cargo ship used to transport additional supplies, which was to be abandoned or dismantled once its supplies were depleted. The crew was diverse, with over 150 men aboard the 4 ships. They included sailors, priests, soldiers, carpenters, gunsmiths, translators, a barber, a blacksmith, and even a musician. They were about to embark on a journey of unknown length. Among them was Pero de Alencar, an experienced pilot who had served on African routes, and an Arabic translator, likely a Moor captured during a previous expedition, who would serve as the first intermediary in negotiations along the East African coast. Each ship was equipped with the latest maritime technology, including astrolabes, compasses, quadrants, hourglasses, and detailed maps based on the accounts of previous travelers. Provisions such as biscuits, salt, rice, wine, vinegar, water, and olive oil were loaded, along with trade goods, beads, fabrics, metal knives, copper rings, and glass vessels. Royal gifts for local rulers, including expensive fabrics, jewelry, bowls, and silverware, were stored in special chests. Vasco personally participated in every stage of the preparation. He was not a theorist issuing orders from afar. He inspected the ships, checked the cargo, spoke with officers, and verified the route with navigation specialists. He understood that beyond the Cape of Good Hope lay complete uncertainty, where maps would be useless, and success would depend on discipline, endurance, and the ability to make decisions in the face of the unknown. In the summer of 1497, as the departure date approached, a solemn religious service was held at the Geronimos monastery. Within its walls, swept by the Atlantic winds, prayers were offered for the success of the voyage. Priests blessed the fleet, the king sent written encouragement, and loading was completed at the port. Men slept on the decks, the last barrels were secured in the holds, rigging was tightened, and weapons were checked. The sounds of hammers, shouted commands, and the smell of tar and salt filled the air, as if foreshadowing the changes to come. Vasco da Gama stood on the deck of his flagship, gazing towards the horizon, beyond which lay Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the mysteries that had captivated Portuguese society for over half a century. He knew that in a few days, the ships would leave Europe, and everything that followed would require not only courage but also unwavering clarity of mind. Thus concluded the preparations for a voyage that would forever alter the map of the world. On the morning of July 8, 1497, Lisbon was filled with unusual excitement. Hundreds of people flocked to the port of Restelo to witness the departure of the expedition that would write a new chapter in history. The 4 ships were ready to sail. Vasco da Gama stood on the flagship São Gabriel, fully armed, with an expression of restrained determination on his face. Farewells to family and country were accompanied by bells, prayers, and the murmur of voices. At the captain's signal, the fleet moved down the Tagus River, heading towards the ocean. The first weeks of the voyage were spent along the coasts of Portugal and northwestern Africa. The crews adjusted to life at sea, learning to work together. Vasco personally oversaw discipline and the condition of the ships, knowing that the main dangers still lay ahead. It was crucial to test the seaworthiness of the vessels and the cohesion of the crews. In mid-July, the expedition reached the Canary Islands, where they did not linger, fearing Spanish interference. Continuing onward, they arrived at the Cape Verde archipelago, off the coast of Africa, where they stopped to replenish their freshwater supplies and check the rigging. It was from here that they would venture into the open ocean, embarking on a journey that would test the limits of human endurance and forever change the world's understanding of its own geography. Vasco da Gama, heeding the counsel of seasoned navigators, made a pivotal decision to steer clear of the African coast and embark on a wide, southwest arc into the open Atlantic. This strategic maneuver, a calculated gamble, aimed to harness the consistent winds further out at sea, promising a swifter passage towards the southern tip of the continent. The wisdom of this choice lay not only in speed but also in avoiding the treacherous calms and debilitating diseases that plagued the tropical waters hugging the Guinean coastline. However, this calculated avoidance came at a price. The expedition was now committed to a protracted and grueling voyage across the vast expanse of the South Atlantic. For weeks, the coastline vanished from sight, replaced by the endless horizon of the ocean. The ships, their sails billowing, pressed onward, yet the relentless heat became an oppressive adversary. Food supplies began to spoil, the water stored in barrels stagnated, and the crew's clothing rotted from constant dampness. Mold, an insidious invader, spread throughout the vessels, a constant reminder of the harsh conditions. The men, already weakened by the oppressive heat and stifling humidity, began to succumb to illness, with diarrhea becoming a common ailment. Anxiety gnawed at their spirits. The sheer scale of the unknown, the isolation from land, and the ever-present fear of being lost forever in the boundless ocean took their toll, even on the most resilient among them. One fateful night, a fierce storm descended upon the flotilla, scattering the ships across the turbulent waters. Vasco da Gama temporarily lost visual contact with the other vessels, a terrifying reminder of their vulnerability. Only with the aid of prearranged signal lanterns were they able to reunite by morning. This harrowing experience underscored the precariousness of their situation, highlighting how easily the ships could be separated and lost in the immensity of the ocean. In response, Vasco da Gama implemented stricter regulations for signal exchanges and enforced rigorous rules for nighttime watches, hoping to prevent future incidents. As October arrived, the expedition ventured into the southern latitudes, where the air temperature gradually began to drop, offering a welcome respite from the oppressive heat. However, this change in climate brought new challenges. Storms grew more frequent and intense, and the winds became increasingly treacherous. The ships endured a constant barrage of damage, with stays snapping, ropes breaking, and sails tearing. Sailors were occasionally swept overboard by rogue waves, lost to the unforgiving sea before help could reach them. The São Rafael suffered a particularly severe setback when its rudder swelled, making it difficult to maintain course. The crew was forced to jettison cargo and descend into the hold to pump out water, a relentless battle against the encroaching sea. Disease continued to ravage the crew. While the understanding of scurvy remained rudimentary, its devastating effects were becoming increasingly apparent. Sailors began to lose their teeth, their strength waned, and painful ulcers erupted on their legs. One by one, men succumbed to illness, some succumbing to fever, others to sheer exhaustion. A particularly violent storm, encountered in the vicinity of present-day Angola, shattered a portion of the deck structure on the supply ship, rendering it a significant liability. Despite these hardships, the expedition pressed onward, driven by da Gama's unwavering resolve. On November 4, the ships finally reached the southern coast of Africa and began their approach to the Cape of Good Hope, the legendary landmark that marked the gateway to the unknown. The cape itself was familiar to the Portuguese through the descriptions of Diogo Chao, but everyone understood that rounding it was far more than simply navigating around a promontory. It was a place where opposing winds converged, where the ocean raged with untamed fury, and where ships could vanish in a matter of hours. And that is precisely what happened. For more than 3 weeks, the ships battled the elements, unable to round the cape. Sometimes, the wind would push them back westward, and at other times, they would be becalmed, trapped in a frustrating stillness. Water supplies dwindled, and provisions grew increasingly scarce. On the São Gabriel, the cook succumbed to the harsh conditions, his mind broken by the heat, the fumes from the hold, and the overall exhaustion. Another sailor was swept overboard by a wave, lost to the sea. Recognizing the dire situation, Vasco da Gama insisted on a brief stop in St. Helena Bay. Here, the weary sailors were able to set foot on land for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. They gathered fresh herbs, washed their clothes, and repaired the damaged rigging. They encountered the local Khoikhoi pastoralists, nomadic people who observed the newcomers with cautious curiosity. Initially, the contact was tentative, marked by gestures and attempts to exchange beads and trinkets. However, the fragile peace was shattered when a conflict erupted. Perhaps a Portuguese sailor had shown disrespect, or perhaps they had misunderstood a local prohibition. Whatever the cause, the altercation resulted in the injury of a soldier, prompting Vasco da Gama to order a swift retreat to avoid further bloodshed. This was the first encounter with the inhabitants of southern Africa, a stark reminder that ignorance of local customs and language could have dire consequences. Finally, at the end of November, taking advantage of a shift in the wind, the flotilla successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope. All the ships had survived, albeit battered and damaged. The masts creaked, the hulls needed repair, and the crews were utterly exhausted. But most importantly, they had crossed a barrier, a boundary of the known world. Ahead lay the eastern coast of Africa, the monsoon winds, and the enigmatic India, now just one final, but crucial, leg away. As the Portuguese flotilla rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the sailors felt, for the first time in a long time, that the most dangerous part of their journey might be behind them. But this was an illusion. Ahead lay the unfamiliar eastern coast of Africa, a land where no European ship had previously sailed in search of a route to India. The ship sailed northeast along the coast, encountering new currents, shifting winds, and coastal cities long dominated by Muslim merchants connected to the Arab world and India. This was a civilized part of the continent, with its own rules, alliances, and a language of diplomacy for which the Portuguese were unprepared. The condition of the crews was dire. Scurvy, heat, spoiled water, and limited food supplies were taking their toll. Many could barely stand. One by one, sailors died. Those who could still work were forced to toil, patching sails, cleaning holds, bailing water, and chasing rats. The diseases they had battled in the South Atlantic continued to sap their strength. They needed a stop, fresh water, fresh food, and a place to recover. The first major stop was the island of Mozambique, which the flotilla reached in early March 1498. It was an important trading center controlled by a Muslim ruler. Mistaking the Portuguese for Turks or Muslim sailors, the local authorities greeted them politely. Vasco da Gama did not dispel the misconception. The appearance, beards, dark clothes, and unknown origin of the guests allowed them to temporarily conceal that they were Christians. An exchange of gifts and goods began immediately. From the Portuguese side came trinkets, fabrics, glass, and on the local side rice, coconuts, meat, and bananas. But a language problem quickly emerged. Their only translator, a Moor captured in Morocco, knew only Moroccan Arabic and did not understand the local Swahili dialects. Misunderstandings grew, and suspicion too. On board the São Gabriel, it was noticed that some merchants were beginning to refuse contact, and someone whispered the word Nazarene, as Christians were called. Then a local judge directly stated, "These people are not Muslims." The atmosphere changed. The ruler of Mozambique, outwardly calm, decided to act subtly. He sent 2 pilots as a gift, as a sign of trust. But in reality, the goal was to disorient the expedition and send it into dangerous waters. One of these pilots soon began to give strange advice, changing course, and confusing the names of cities. Vasco da Gama suspected deception. The pilot was interrogated, and he confessed that he had received a secret order to direct the ships into a reef to destroy them.
After this incident, the Portuguese left Mozambique.
The next destination was Mombasa, a wealthy city-state with which the Portuguese hoped to establish relations.
However, Mombasa proved hostile.
The arrival of the flotilla was already known, and they were not greeted with open arms. Armed boats stood at the entrance to the port, and warnings came from the shore. At night, unknown persons tried to sneak up to the ships with torches and ropes, probably to sabotage or set them on fire.
The crews opened warning fire from arquebus and cannons.
In the morning, it became clear that they could not stay there.
The Portuguese left without engaging in battle. Hope appeared only in Malindi, an ancient city that was at odds with Mombasa and seeking allies against it.
When the fleet approached the city, the local rulers sent messengers to the ships with gifts, fruits, fabrics, and small animals.
Negotiations began quickly.
Da Gama, although he did not trust anyone, realized that here he was ready to be seen as a potential partner. He went ashore, where a ceremony of exchanging gifts took place. In response to velvet and jewelry, he received horse hides, meat, honey, and, most importantly, the agreement to provide an experienced pilot. This man, whose name is indicated differently in various sources, but most often remains unknown, turned out to be truly knowledgeable in monsoon winds and sea routes. Some 19th-century pilots mistakenly called him Ahmed ibn Majid, but modern research rejects this version. By the time Da Gama arrived, he was already old and probably had never been to Malindi. The real pilot was most likely from India, possibly from Gujarat, and was in Malindi as a hired sea guide. He knew exactly the direction of the winds, the currents, and was able to calculate the moment of departure for crossing the Indian Ocean. While preparations were underway for the final push, the ships were put in order, the rigging was repaired, the hulls were patched, and water and food were loaded on board. The sun was already high, and spring in the Indian Ocean was beginning. And with it, the time of the favorable monsoon was approaching. A disturbing silence reigned on the ships, from fatigue, from the unknown, from fear of what awaited beyond the horizon. Vasco da Gama looked east, toward where, according to stories, India lay. In a few days, the flotilla would weigh anchor, leave Malindi, and go into the open sea toward the shores where splendor and the palaces of the Rajas stood. But what awaited them there? Gold, betrayal, death, or victory?
No one knew. In mid-April 1498, shortly after leaving Malindi, the Portuguese flotilla moved into the open ocean. The crossing of the Indian Ocean took about 23 days, and all this time the wind was fair, the sky was clear, and the sea was calm. The monsoon current did not fail.
Thanks to the experience of the native guide, the ship sailed confidently, almost without deviating from course.
People were recovering from long weeks of illness and storms.
But the tension did not subside. Ahead was a land they had only heard about in legends. On May 20th, the expedition entered the coastal waters of Malabar, a densely populated region stretching along the southwestern coast of India. On this day, the flotilla dropped anchor near Calicut, one of the largest and richest port cities in Asia. Trade routes from Persia, Arabia, Africa, and Southeast Asia converged here. Towers of Hindu temples rose above the docks, Arab dhows and junks from Indonesia stood at the pier, and shops of Gujarati, Persian, and Yemeni merchants lined the streets. For the Portuguese, this was a completely new world.
At first, the meeting went smoothly.
Locals looked curiously at the strangers, but in Calicut they were accustomed to foreign merchants, especially Muslims arriving from Egypt and Mecca. No one raised the alarm, but the Portuguese felt they were being watched. The first mission to shore was organized with caution. Da Gama sent an envoy with gifts and a letter from King Manuel, a diplomatic presentation with the hope that the newcomers would be received as representatives of a powerful European ruler. The head of the Calicut state was called Zamarin by the Portuguese. The initial encounter seemed promising, yet the Portuguese gifts, consisting of mediocre cloth, a few glass trinkets, some wine, and weaponry, lacked the substantial value to impress the Zamarin. These offerings held little appeal in the bustling Indian marketplace, where gold, silver, and fine textiles were the standard of trade.
The Zamarin, unimpressed, saw no reason to grant these newcomers special privileges.
He cautiously agreed to a trial exchange, a small-scale transaction to gauge the potential of future dealings. Da Gama, eager to establish a foothold, handed over a portion of his goods to local intermediaries, hoping to secure spices like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger in return. The promise was made that future Portuguese vessels would arrive bearing more valuable merchandise, a pledge intended to entice the Zamarin into a more formal agreement.
However, the fragile peace was soon shattered by an incident instigated by rival Muslim merchants.
These established traders, wary of the Portuguese intrusion into their lucrative domain, presented the Zamarin with a list of accusations. They claimed the Portuguese had arrived without proper authorization and that some of their goods were contraband, smuggled into the port without paying the necessary duties. Indian officials, fearing the wrath of the powerful Islamic trading elite and eager to maintain stability within their port, arrested several of Da Gama's envoys and impounded a portion of the Portuguese cargo.
News of this betrayal reached Da Gama, igniting his fury.
He demanded the immediate release of his men and the return of his goods, retrieving as many of his crew as possible from the shore.
While the conflict was eventually resolved, a bitter taste lingered. Da Gama realized that until the Portuguese could offer India truly valuable commodities, gaining respect and establishing a strong partnership would remain an uphill battle.
The expedition departed Calicut in late August without a formal agreement, though their ships held sacks of pepper, cinnamon, and a small quantity of other spices. The amount was not commercially significant, but it was enough to prove to Lisbon that the sea route to India was not only open but also capable of yielding riches. From that moment on, the Portuguese harbored no doubts about the validity of their mission. The expedition had justified itself, and the promise of wealth fueled their ambition.
Ahead lay the return voyage, a trial that would test their endurance and resolve.
The decks of the ships already carried the scent of spices, and in the hearts of the sailors, the belief that they were making history took root. In late August, the Portuguese fleet left the Malabar coast, carrying bags of spices, letters from the Zamarin, and a crew of weary men who were beginning to understand the price of their victory. The primary objective had been achieved, the sea route to India had been found, opening the door to trade, even without a formal agreement. However, the greatest challenge was yet to come. The return journey, stretching over many months, became a test not only of endurance but also of humanity. Da Gama had hoped to take advantage of the monsoon winds, but their departure was too late. The northeast monsoon was already weakening, and the ships moved slowly, struggling through the waves and the humid heat. Supplies of water and food began to dwindle rapidly. The heat intensified, the rigging wore out, and the sails struggled to maintain their course. Scurvy, which had already affected some of the crew while in India, now spread throughout the ships. Men's teeth fell out, their bodies were covered in sores, and delirium and weakness set in. Almost every day, sailors died, sometimes several at once. Paulo da Gama, Vasco's brother, and the captain of the São Rafael, also fell ill. The disease progressed rapidly, with high fever and bloody sores on his legs. Despite his suffering, he continued to perform his duties until the very end, giving orders, checking the watches, and speaking with the officers. Vasco visited him every day, bringing him water and ordering that he be given the best pieces of provisions. The brothers tried not to discuss death, but it was felt in every silence. They were not sure if they would ever return home. The crossing of the Indian Ocean dragged on. The fleet sailed erratically, losing course, encountering frequent storms. Squalls tore sails, torrential rains flooded the decks, and mold grew in the holds, rotting the food supplies. One of the sailors, delirious, reportedly threw himself into the sea. Another died from being struck by a barrel that had broken loose from its restraints. The dead were no longer buried with ceremonies. Bodies were simply thrown overboard to free up space. When the ships reached the east coast of Africa, the Sultan of Malindi again allowed them to stop. The Portuguese received water, some provisions, and the opportunity to rest on shore. But this was a brief respite. The condition of the ships was becoming critical. The rigging was worn out, the hull was leaking, and the crews were dwindling. Vasco made a difficult decision: the São Rafael was beyond repair. The crew was almost entirely depleted, and Paulo was unable to command. The remaining sailors and valuable cargo were transferred to the other ships, and the ship in which his brother had spent the entire journey was scuttled. The remaining ships continued along the coast of Africa, stopping in bays to replenish water but not lingering. Many of those who remained could no longer move, lying on the deck covered with faded fabrics, with empty stares and barely discernible breaths. Only 2 ships survived the Cape of Good Hope, the São Gabriel and the Barrio.
Here, da Gama ordered them to separate.
The Barrio went ahead to deliver news of their return as soon as possible.
It reached Portugal in July 1499, becoming the first ship to return from India by sea.
Vasco, with the remaining sailors and his sick brother, stopped in the Azores, where Paulo soon died.
Da Gama himself arrived in Lisbon only in September.
He returned a changed man, emaciated, silent, with eyes that reflected the countless deaths of those who remained at sea. Of the more than 170 men who had left Lisbon 2 years earlier, only 55 returned home. The rest had died of disease, in storms, been killed, or buried nameless in foreign lands. Despite the heavy price, their return was met with triumph. King Manuel received Vasco at court, listened to his report, examined the maps, looked at the sacks of pepper, the fabrics from Calicut, the ceramics, the Arabic letters, and the modest treasures. He understood that the sea route was open. And even though the profit was still symbolic, the political and strategic significance of the voyage was undeniable. Vasco was rewarded. He was granted the title of Dom, land, a pension, and the right to be preceded by an honor guard. But the celebration did not touch his heart.
Contemporary accounts noted that da Gama rarely spoke of the return.
He remained silent about the hardships and did not mention the dead, never calling out their names. He had crossed the ocean, opened the route, passed the trials, and returned, but had forever lost what would have made the return complete. Thus ended the first Portuguese sea voyage to India, a journey that cost incredible effort, pain, and death, but gave Europe new life. From that moment on, the door once open to the oceanic abyss could never be closed.
After his return to Portugal, Vasco da Gama's name became a symbol of a new era.
He was met with honors, received a title, land grants, a lifetime pension, and the respect of the king.
However, he himself showed no enthusiasm.
Tired of the long journey, having scuttled one ship, buried his brother, and lost most of his crew, he knew the price of victory all too well. The route to India had been opened, but it had not yet become a road to power. Local rulers remained independent, trade was not established, there were no alliances, and Portugal was still a stranger to India, not a force. A year later, King Manuel I sent a larger fleet to India under the command of Pedro Álvares Cabral. Its goal was to establish a permanent trading post in Calicut and establish stable trade relations.
However, after initial success, the Portuguese faced resistance from the Muslim trading elite.
Soon the trading post was destroyed, and about 70 Portuguese were killed. In response, Cabral ordered the city to be shelled, destroying several ships and port warehouses. This clash became a turning point, making it clear that without military force, the Portuguese would not gain recognition in India.
3 years after his return, Vasco da Gama was ordered to lead a new expedition.
Now he was not just an ambassador, but an admiral with official authority to use force. The fleet was significantly larger, consisting of 15 to 20 ships, including heavy carracks and maneuverable caravels. There were about 1,500 men on board, including Vasco's nephew, Estevão, who was about 15 years old at the time.
The expedition departed from Lisbon in April. The journey to India took about 4 months.
Knowing the route and relying on the experience of the first voyage, Vasco acted faster and more decisively. He stopped again in Malindi, where he was warmly received by the local ruler, replenished his supplies of water and food, and received fresh information about the situation on the Malabar coast. There, he was joined by experienced pilots who knew the monsoon currents well. In India, da Gama first headed not to Calicut, but to the friendly port of Cananore, where he concluded a temporary agreement with the local Raja.
Cananore was a longtime rival of the Calicut state and willingly provided the Portuguese with a platform for trade.
From there, Vasco began a blockade of Muslim trade routes, seizing Arab ships, arresting crews, and confiscating cargo. He behaved not as a diplomat, but as a military leader who had decided to demonstrate strength even before officially entering into negotiations.
Only then did he go to Calicut.
Upon arrival, Vasco da Gama was again met by envoys of the Zamarin, who expressed his willingness to forget old grievances and restore trade relations.
However, da Gama no longer trusted promises.
He demanded the extradition of all those responsible for the murder of the Portuguese under Cabral, full compensation for losses, and official permission to build a fortified trading post. The Zamarin, seeking to maintain a balance between the Portuguese and Muslim traders, avoided making tough decisions. Vasco gave him several days to think, and then began a blockade of the port. Local ships heading to Calicut were intercepted, and their cargo was confiscated.
Of particular note is the incident with a large ship carrying pilgrims to Mecca. There were about 300 people on board, including women and children.
Vasco da Gama ordered the ship to be captured, and after the Zamarin refused to comply with his demands, he ordered it to be burned along with its passengers.
This action horrified even some of his own officers and remains one of the most brutal episodes of early colonial history. After that, Vasco sent a new ultimatum, but the Zamarin, refusing to yield, strengthened the coastal defenses.
In response, Portuguese ships opened artillery fire on the coastal part of the Calicut port. For several days, they shelled warehouses, residential quarters, and piers. Then the fleet moved south to Cochin, where the local Raja, seeking to enlist support against Calicut's influence, provided the Portuguese with land for a trading post and allowed them to leave a garrison. Here, Vasco first secured an official Portuguese military presence in India. Warehouses and defensive structures were built, and artillerymen and merchants were left behind. He concluded a trade agreement, exchanged gifts with the ruler, and received a promise of pepper supplies in the next season. This became the first step towards creating a future colonial structure. In the spring of 1503, da Gama began his journey home. The return was relatively calm. Thanks to pre-planned stops, routes, and familiar ports on the African coast, the fleet avoided major losses. Upon arrival in Lisbon, he was greeted as a triumphant hero. He brought treaties with the signatures of Indian rulers and, most importantly, proof that Portugal could not only reach India but also dictate terms to it. However, along with success, Vasco gained a reputation as a cruel and harsh commander. His methods were controversial. Some called him a hero, others a scourge. He acted not as a diplomat, but as a man convinced that it was easier to pave the way through gunpowder and flames than through trade talks. The Portuguese presence in India, initially forged through the endeavors of figures like Cabral, da Gama, and Albuquerque, was becoming increasingly complex. The system they had established, while expanding, was also becoming riddled with corruption and impunity. Trading posts, garrisons, and commercial agreements stretching from Malabar to Hormuz became arenas for personal enrichment and abuse. Positions were bought and sold, or passed down through connections. Complaints about arbitrary rule, deception of local allies, theft, and violence were increasingly reaching Lisbon. The new system of governance through appointed governors was failing to address the issues. Connections with the metropolis were weak, while local interests were strong. King João III, who ascended the throne in 1521, understood the gravity of the situation. He realized that if he did not intervene, Portuguese India would lose its stability. He began searching for someone capable of restoring order, someone not only experienced but also authoritative, respected, and fearless. The choice fell upon the veteran navigator whose name still commanded respect on both sides of the ocean. In April 1524, Vasco da Gama was appointed Viceroy of India, a title he had never officially held before. This was not merely an honorary title but a sign of the extreme seriousness of the situation. The crown was calling upon the man who had once opened the way to return and restore order. At that time, Vasco da Gama was around 60 years old. He suffered from gout, often moved with difficulty, and complained of pain in his joints and bouts of weakness. Doctors warned him that the journey could prove fatal, but he did not refuse. He likely perceived this appointment as a duty to protect the work of his entire life from ultimate decay. The fleet on which he sailed was small but well equipped. Vasco was accompanied by 2 of his sons, scribes, trusted officers, and a chaplain. On board, they carried royal decrees, charters, lists of appointments, and powers allowing him to remove, judge, and, if necessary, punish. This was not a triumphant voyage but a mission to restore control, directed not against enemies but against allies who had begun to behave like masters. He arrived in the Indian Ocean in the late summer of 1524. In Cochin, where he landed in September, he was met with caution. In the intervening years, a new generation of officials had grown up for whom da Gama was a semi-legendary figure, rigid, stubborn, and alien to their personal interests, but respect for him remained. No one dared to openly oppose the crown-appointed viceroy. Da Gama immediately began to act. He ordered an audit of all garrisons, a review of appointed duties, and a verification of treaties with local rulers. Several factory managers were suspended, and one was arrested for abuse of power. A case was opened against shipowners who had organized unaccounted trade with Muslim merchants in violation of royal decrees. In the treasury of Cochin, a shortage of silver was discovered, and in one of the ports, hidden goods intended for illegal export were found. Punishments followed quickly and demonstratively. He restored discipline among the soldiers, forbade unauthorized raids, limited the collection of gifts from local residents, and began negotiations with the Raja of Cochin to revise treaties, not to increase pressure but to restore lost trust. His actions were not as cruel as in his youth. Now, they reflected the restrained, almost bitter determination of a man who had come not to avenge but to correct. He sought to streamline and rebuild, even at the cost of his own health. However, time was short. In October, his health deteriorated sharply. Gout attacks became more severe, accompanied by fever and weakness. He refused to rest for long periods, continuing to dictate orders, receiving reports in an armchair, surrounded by doctors and servants. His letters to Lisbon, sent in November, were full of anxiety. He knew he would not be able to do everything, but he asked the king to continue his work, to strictly monitor appointments, and to punish those who violated the trust of the crown. By mid-December, he was bedridden. He dictated his last orders from his bed. He received the sacraments a few days before the end, calmly, without ritualistic displays. He said goodbye to his sons, repeating that he was dying on the land he had once discovered and asked for nothing else. Witnesses noted that his last hours passed in silence. He died at dawn in a stone house at the entrance to Cochin, far from his homeland but not alone. Thus ended the last mission of Vasco da Gama, not a naval or military one, but an administrative one, bitter and constrained by time. He did not return as a hero, he remained to die as a servant of the crown. The news of Vasco da Gama's death spread quickly throughout Cochin. He was not merely a high-ranking official but a man whose name was known to all warriors, merchants, and local rulers alike. The Raja of Cochin expressed his condolences and sent his representative to the farewell ceremony. Representatives of the Catholic mission organized a service in the Church of St. Francis, where he was temporarily buried. This was the first European church on Indian soil, an irony or a symbol, but it became the first resting place of the Portuguese seafarer. Da Gama's coffin was placed near the altar on the right-hand side. The service was solemn but restrained. The choir sang psalms, the priest spoke of devotion to service, and a scribe read Luke's account of the recognition of Simeon. Merchants and officers stood in silence, while in the port, according to chroniclers, not a single cannon salute was fired out of respect for the deceased. Vasco da Gama's body remained in Cochin for many years. Only years later, at the initiative of his widow and with the consent of the king, was the decision made to rebury him in his homeland. To this end, the body was exhumed, placed in a fortified catafalque, provided with guards, and sent on one of the caravels returning to Lisbon. The voyage was long but uneventful. Upon arrival in Portugal, the remains were solemnly transported to Videgueira, the town associated with da Gama's title, where the family chapel was located. There, the body was buried in a specially built chapel. The tomb received a headstone with an epitaph in Portuguese, along with family crests and symbols of the Order of Christ, to which he belonged. However, even this burial proved not to be the last. In the 19th century, when Portugal was experiencing a period of romantic interest in its great heroes and when the country was seeking symbols of national unity and past greatness, the decision was made to transfer Vasco da Gama's remains to the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon, an architectural monument of the very era he represented. There, in a marble tomb adorned with bas-reliefs depicting ships, crosses, and an inscription in Latin, his remains rest to this day, next to the tomb of Luís de Camões, the poet who immortalized da Gama's voyage in the epic poem Os Lusíadas. Thus, even after death, his journey continued, from India to Videgueira, from Videgueira to the heart of Lisbon. In this journey lies the entire fate of Vasco da Gama. He did not belong to one place, he belonged to the entire world, which he himself helped to connect. But on that December day in 1524 in Cochin, all of this was still in the future. Then, all that witnesses saw was a lonely man who died not on the battlefield and not in a storm, but in an armchair, looking at the sea that had become his destiny, precisely there, in that very India, where he had once paved the way through the unknown. He was the first among the Portuguese to forever close the circle between life and the ocean. More than 500 years have passed since Vasco da Gama's ships first left the harbor of Lisbon, heading for shores that Europeans then knew only from vague tales, ancient maps, and rumors of the wonders of the East. Since then, eras have changed, empires have disappeared, and the very nature of travel has changed, but the path he laid remains etched in human memory because it was not simply a route between 2 points on a map. It became a boundary between two worlds, that which existed before him and that which appeared after. The discovery of the sea route to India via the Cape of Good Hope was not merely a geographical achievement, it changed the entire structure of world trade. Until the end of the 15th century, spices, silks, and jewels of the East reached Europe via a long and costly route through Arab and Venetian intermediaries. After da Gama reached Calicut, Portuguese ships began to enter Indian ports themselves, trading directly and returning with goods that previously passed through 3 or 4 pairs of hands. Portugal, a relatively small kingdom on the edge of Europe, became a maritime power with overseas strongholds, a fleet, an army, and revenues that its neighbors could only dream of. At the initiative of Vasco and his successors, trading posts and fortified settlements appeared along the coast of India, from where goods were shipped and where ships loaded with gunpowder, fabrics, wine, copper, and weapons arrived. In return, they took away spices, pearls, porcelain, Indian fabrics, and much more. This was the beginning of globalization, not yet political, but already economic. However, Vasco da Gama's legacy is not limited to trade. His voyage shattered previous notions of geography. Until the end of the 15th century, European scholars relied on ancient maps in which India occupied a mythical place, and Africa remained a semi-closed continent. Da Gama proved that there was a sea route to the east and that it was possible to bypass Africa, not relying on legends but following the stars and calculations. His journey became proof that the boundaries of knowledge are fluid and that perseverance can replace dogma. For Portugal, his name became a symbol of the era. Already during his lifetime, he was surrounded by glory as a mariner, diplomat, and viceroy, but the real mythology developed later. Luís de Camões, the greatest poet of Portugal, made him the main hero of Os Lusíadas, the national epic in which Vasco's voyage is transformed into a symbol of the mission of a people chosen by God. In this work, history is intertwined with myth, and da Gama appears not merely as a man but as a bearer of destiny. Through him, Camões showed the greatness of a people ready to challenge the sea, time, and themselves. However, not everything in da Gama's legacy was bright. His expeditions opened the way for colonial expansion. Following the caravels came gunboats, missionaries, and officials. Where he traded and negotiated, shots later rang out, and the flags of the crown were raised. His name was known in Cochin and Calicut, but often remembered with anxiety. In one of his campaigns, he ordered a ship with Muslim pilgrims to be burned, which forever remained a shadow on his reputation. Historians argue whether he was only a soldier of his era or consciously used cruelty as an instrument of power. And yet, his personal example was inspiring. He was born into a provincial family without wealth or nobility, did not receive a classical university education, but thanks to perseverance, a sharp mind, and faith in his goal, he became the first person who could go where the maps ended. He was not a theorist, he was an executor, and perhaps that is precisely why his path turned out to be not just drawn but traversed. His descendants continued his work. His son, Estevão da Gama, became governor of Portuguese India. The da Gama family bore the title of Counts of Vidigueira and remained one of the most respected in the kingdom. Today, his tomb is located in the Jerónimos Monastery, a majestic monument to Portuguese maritime glory. There, in the shadow of high vaults, under bas-reliefs depicting scenes from his life, rests the man who changed the map of the world. Thousands of people pass by his sarcophagus, and many of them no longer remember the details of his biography, but the very idea that one person could so change the course of history remains. Vasco da Gama did not leave philosophical works or create a system of views, but his voyage became an affirmation of the idea that if there is something unknown before you, but you believe that it exists, then it can be achieved.